All right. Thanks everyone who's coming in. We'll get started in just a couple minutes. All right. I can see my screen here. See if it'll let me do this. Great, so we'll get started. Can everyone, welcome everyone to the 2020 Fox Cities Book Festival. We are so excited to have everyone joining us virtually this year. Okay, just got one more people coming in there. Great. We'll just wait there. All right, so the book festival, we've got the book festival going on this week. We also have Fox Cities Reads in collaboration with our festival events this year. Our Fox Cities Reads author event was rescheduled from April. So we've got a couple of events going on with that this week as well. So each fall we offer a week-long festival featuring a variety of local and authors throughout the country. We do workshops, panels, discussions, readings, all sorts of events. And so this year we were able to quickly reimagine it and offer a bunch of virtual events this week. All of our events are focused on connecting readers and writers, and our events are also free to attend, which is something that we really couldn't do without the support of our community, public libraries, and all of our fabulous readers here who support us all year round and throughout the festival week. So just want to take a moment to acknowledge all of our partners and sponsors. Again, thank you so much for keeping the book festival free and really great events every year. So there. And then we also want to invite you and encourage you, if you want to get involved in the book festival, you can always make a donation, foxcitiesbookfestival.org. You can visit us on Facebook, and you can also send us an email. We're happy to reach out with you. Grab this. We also have a code of conduct with our attendees for our virtual events. We ask that everybody is respectful and kind to one another and while you're attending our virtual events. If we were to have any sort of harassment or disruptions, we would ask you to leave privately. So it's just something to be mindful of. But without further ado, we're super excited. We've got a great event today, so thank you so much for joining us. So we've got Justina Ireland with us today. So I'm gonna go ahead and stop sharing my screen here and pass it over to her. So thank you so much for joining us. I'm gonna throw it over to you. And it should work now. All right, you should be on. Thank you.
So great to see everyone virtually, at least. My name is Justina Ireland. I'm author of a number of books. Most famous is Dread Nation, which posits what would happen if the zombie apocalypse started at the Battle of Gettysburg, and the sequel, Deathless Divide. So if you are in the mood for kind of a seasonal book, a seasonal read with some history and some zombies, this is it. Today I'm going to read to you a selection from Dread Nation. It is about the first time the main character, Jane, has ever saw the dead. In her world, of course, the dead are called shamblers. They're the restless dead, and even though the zombie apocalypse started at the Battle of Gettysburg, we're 17 years after the fact. So this is America where a lot of the things have changed because of the undead plague, but a lot of things have remained the same. So this is chapter 3 of Dread Nation, in which I relate my first encounter with a shambler. When I was little, back at Rose Hill, I used to sneak out the kitchen, away from Auntie Aggie while she and the other aunties worked to feed all the hungry mouths on the plantation. Once they were distracted, I'd tiptoe out past the ovens and slip away to freedom in the fields. Rose Hill mostly grew tobacco, which Mama and a couple of the bigger field hands would ride into town to trade for cloth and other essentials. Early on, back before I can remember, Mama had tried growing tomatoes and other vegetables. When it became obvious that a small bundle of tobacco was worth more than all the food combined, she switched. Mama is savvy like that. The dead may have risen, and we might have been living in the end times of Revelation, but folks still wanted their tobacco. Tobacco plants grew tall, and the leaves were broad and green. In the summer, I could duck down and run through the rows undetected, which is what I did on this particular day. My goal was always the same: find the other kids, the ones that got to run the fields because their mamas weren't ladies who owned the plantation. The kids I liked best would be near the barrier fence at the far side of the tobacco field, so I made a beeline for that patch of trouble. A barrier fence is a line of security between shamblers and the rest of us, and Rose Hill had 3 such fences: white painted fence rails that had been our original property line and weren't more than pretty decoration, a dense forest of wooden poles with sharpened ends implanted in the ground at an angle that worked like stakes to impale any shambler enterprising enough to get to it, and at the outer edge, a wall of 5-strand barbed wire that was our primary defense against the dead. Once or twice a day, the stronger men would go out to the barbed wire and any shamblers tangled up in it. Mama would have them bring the corpses in and burn them for the compost pile. If there were any valuables on the body, Mama and a couple of the men would sell them in town, bringing back something fine. One time there was a shambler that must have been a fine lady, since she was decked out in gold and jewels. Mama used the baubles to buy several hogs, and that was how Rose Hill came to have pork chops every Sunday after the scripture was read. But I didn't care much for that business. I was more interested in the children who hung out playing games in between the fences. I scrambled over the white split rail fence and carefully picked my way past the sharpened stakes of the interior fence. And there, between the safety of Rose Hill and the danger of the outside world, were the plantation kids. Everyone on the plantation but Mama was a Negro, all excepting for Mr. Isaac. There had been other white men once upon a time, but after the dead rose, they'd either ran off or turned shambler. Mr. Isaac was different. He came to Rose Hill after the war. He lived on the plantation because he was married to Auntie Evelyn, and relations between Negroes and whites were frowned upon. Mama didn't much care for, as she called it, the spiteful leanings of biddies with too much time on their hands, and welcomed folks into the house staff as long as they didn't make too much trouble and were happy to work hard. So Mr. Isaac and Auntie Evelyn lived on Rose Hill Plantation with a passel of boys, the worst of which were the twins. Auntie Aggie said twins were an ill omen, and anyone who knew the Isaac twins would agree. The boys were light-skinned, lighter than me, sandy-hued with unnervingly blue eyes. They always had a scam running, like the time they'd stolen watermelon from the garden and climbed up a tree to share it, or the time they'd let loose all the dogs as a distraction so they could run off to fish in the creek on the north side of Rose Hill. The Isaac twins were always up to no good. They were my favorite people in the whole damn world. "Hey there, Jane," called Ezekiel, Zeke for short. "Aw, Jane's here. Now we're gonna get the strap for sure," said his brother Joseph, who was saltier than Lot's wife. "I snuck off," I said, as the other kids began to give me dirty looks. "Ain't no one know I'm gone. What are you doing?" Each of the kids held a stick, the end sharpened, and had the look of someone with a secret. "None of your business. Go back to the kitchens," Joe said, picking up a rock from the dusty ground and throwing it at me. The rock missed by a mile, but the one I picked up and flipped back at Joe didn't. It hit him right in the middle of his forehead, and as he cried out, I picked up another rock. "Next person who throws a rock at me is getting what for right in their eye," I said, shaking with anger. "No one's going to throw any rocks, Jane. You should come with us. We're going to kill it dead." Zeke smiled wide and handed me a sharpened stick. While Joseph was prickly and hostile, Zeke was all smiles and warmth, the kind of person people like to be around. And he had the best ideas. It was no wonder Joe was so touchy. Who would want to share such a wonderful brother with everyone? I took the stick. "What do you mean, kill the dead?" "There's a shambler stuck in the barbed wire. We're going to kill it." That ain't a good idea. As soon as the words were out of my mouth, I knew it was the wrong thing to say. But I couldn't help it. I like trouble as much as the next kid, but this seemed different, dangerous. We're gonna kill it so we can go on patrols with the rest of the grown-ups, Zeke said with a grin. No more chores for us. You can stay here, Jane. No one wants you tagging along anyway, Joe said. I set my jaw. Whatever Joe said, I was going to do the opposite, just to spot him. I'm coming. You probably ain't found a shambler anyhow. Oh, it's a shambler, all right, Zeke said. You'll see. We marched in silence along the line of fence rails. A few of the kids began to whisper excitedly, but a single glance back from Joe shut them up real quick. My stomach surged and gurgled, roiling with hot dread. I'd heard Mom and the other farmhands talk about how the dead worked, how they came out of the brush, overwhelming the unwary and wary alike. That was what made shamblers so scary. Even when they were predictable, they could still surprise you. As we rounded the corner, a loud moan split the air. There, twisted up in the barbed wire, was a shambler. We stopped, and all the celebration and shouting died down real quick. I'd always imagined the dead as some kind of monster, mouth gaping as they came to eat you. But the shambler caught in the barbed wire looked almost normal. A white woman with long brown hair pinned up on her head, wearing a day dress of green linen. The skirt was torn, and her petticoat showed through. Her eyes were the yellow of a crooked neck squash, and the nails of her grasping hands had been broken down, her fingers covered with dirt. Still, I recognized her. That's Miss Farmer. Her family owns Apple Hill Plantation, I said. Miss Farmer hadn't cared for me. She thought Negroes shouldn't be allowed in the house since we were dirty. But she loved Mama's blackberry jam enough that she came to call every so often when it was safe to travel. She ain't nobody no more, Joe said, poking her with a stick. The shambler growled and reached for him. Joe danced out of the way, much to the delight of everyone, even me. I ain't sure why we thought poking that shambler with our shopping sticks was a good idea, but everyone started doing it, creeping in close enough to stab the creature and then dancing out of the way before her hands could reach us. The game might have gone on longer if the dead Miss Farmer hadn't managed to pull herself free. Barbed wire ain't a long-term fix for a shambler wanting in onto a plantation. Since they don't have any kind of survival instinct, no big deal for them to eventually pull themselves free of such an entanglement, ripping off great big swatches of themselves to do so. Now this is exactly what the undead Miss Farmer did. One moment she was jammed up in the barbed wire, the next she was stumbling toward us, half a dress and a good bit of arm skin left behind on the fence, which now listed to one side. Most of the kids, myself included, screamed and ran. I took off with a field of shopping sticks, knowing that would slow the undead woman down. But when I looked over my shoulder, I realized that not everyone was with us. Joe was standing right where he'd been, not moving, frozen in the path of the dead woman and her gaping maw. The boy had always been a bully. The thing about bullies is they never learn how to run like the rest of us do. So Joe stood his ground, shopping stick at the ready, convinced he was going to kill that shambler. At some point in the woman's lunge toward Joe, he realized that a stick wasn't much of a weapon against the dead, but it was too late. Joe was about to be shambler chow, if it hadn't been for Zeke. It was Zeke that slammed into Joe, pushing him out of the way of the woman. It was Zeke the woman bit, sinking her teeth deep into his throat. It was Zeke that cried out like a wounded animal, trying for a few precious moments to push the much heavier woman off him as she tore away a great chunk of flesh. And it was Zeke that let out one soft, anguished cry as his laugh bled out into the dirt of Rose Hill, the sound almost indistinguishable over the noise of dead Miss Farmer feeding. Joe! I yelled, and the boy looked at me, expression distant and caught somewhere between grief and horror. I ran back to where he'd landed, pulled him to his feet, and dragged him by the hand through the field of shopping sticks to the safety of Rose Hill. As we ran back, we passed a patrol coming to put down the dead. I didn't stay to watch. I'd seen enough carnage for one day. They say when they got there, Miss Farmer had started on Zeke's face, and that two of the men vomited before they even got to putting her down and driving a nail into Zeke's head so he wouldn't come back. Mama gave Zeke a proper burning and gave Mr. Isaac and Auntie Evelyn his ashes. Joe ran off a few years later, presumably to one of them combat schools, and so their heartbreak was complete. Auntie Aggie clucking her tongue and saying, "Told you them twins was an ill omen." It took me a long time before I left the safety of the main house, and I never ventured to the borders of Rose Hill again, not until I came to Miss Preston's years later. I learned 2 valuable lessons that day. 1, the dead will take everything you love. You have to end them before they can end you. That's exactly what I always aim to do. And 2, the person poking the dead ain't always the one paying for it. In fact, most times it's the ones minding their own business who suffer. That's a problem I still don't have an answer for yet. Thank you. So if you guys don't know while I'm reading, you are more than welcome to leave questions and I will read them. But instead of leaving us on such a somber, grim note, I'm going to change tone a little bit and read a little bit from my first Star Wars book, which is called Lando's Luck. If you are a Star Wars fan, this takes place slightly before the Solo movie. If you are not a Star Wars fan, it's just a fun story about a man and his robot and his ship. So I'm going to go ahead and read the first chapter of Lando's Luck to you. Lando Calrissian looked at his cards one last time and sat back in his chair. He stroked his mustache, smoothing it so each and every hair lay perfectly flat. Lando liked to look good when he won. He was, after all, building a legend. Anyway, there was no point in trying to hide his pleasure. The hand was almost over, and the bets had been laid. Earlier in the evening, Lando had wondered about his luck as he lost hand after hand, but it seemed like it had changed for the better. The corn female across the way kept looking at her dwindling pile of creds, and then back at the cards in her hand in a way that could only be described as worried. The Lena sitting to the left of Lando had started to groom herself, running her paws nervously over the wide, tufted ears on top of her head. Her gray and black striped fur was already immaculate, and the last time she'd begun to groom herself, she'd had the worst hand of the evening. Lando was about to win, and he hadn't even had to cheat. Well, not much at least. Someone entered, and a chill passed through the cantina, the frigid air making Lando wrap his cape a little closer to his body. Hynestia wasn't much of a planet, cold and wintry, frozen tundra of a place with only a small zone of habitable land toward the equator. But Hynestia was known throughout the galaxy for its Carillion fur, a thick pelt that came not from an animal, but a curious sort of lichen that Hynestians cultivated in domes built across the frozen landscape. It was a commodity tightly regulated by the Empire since it had claimed the planet for its own, which made the fur even more desirable. The more something was kept from people, the more they wanted it. And the more that people wanted a thing, the more they were willing to pay for it. Lando was always willing to help, for a fee, of course. It was the Carillion fur that had brought Lando to Hynestia. He had a lead on a particularly valuable relic that a collector was willing to part with for the right price. That price happened to be a crate full of Carillion pelts. And since there was only one place in the galaxy to get Carillion, Lando and his best droid, L337, had gone to Hynestia. But no trip was complete without a few hints of sabacc, especially when the Millennium Falcon was low on fuel and Lando was light on creds. And though Hynestia's lone cantina, the Frozen Cova, wasn't much, just a handful of tables and a single bar tended by a surly man calamari, there were several games of chance going, and what more could a young entrepreneur want? The Corn stared at the pile of creds in the middle of the table and then at her cards again, her facial tentacles waving about in irritation. She let out a deep breath and threw her cards face down on the table. "Fold," she said, standing to leave. She towered over the sabacc table, her blue-green skin glistening in the low light of the cantina. "And I think you've taken enough of my creds for one night, Calrissian." "Well, I am sorry to see you go," Lando said with a respectful nod. She was an excellent player, and Lando always enjoyed playing against someone with skill. "But if you ever find yourself in this part of the galaxy again, Buena, please stop by and say hello." The Corn made a blooping noise that was either agreement or a rude sort of retort. Either way, Lando just kept grinning. He was about to be a very rich man. "And you, my dear," he said, turning toward the Lena running a paw over her ears. Del Gris. That's my name. Not my dear." The Lena had a soft, husky voice that was at odds with her large size. And I'm not out of it just yet. Zell tossed a few more creds into the pile on the table and exchanged a couple of her cards. It was her last exchange, and any worry that might have plagued Lando evaporated when her whiskers twitched once and then again. She still held a terrible hand. Well, I suppose that's that, Lando said. He spread his cards across the table. Pure sabacc. The Lena heaved a sigh and stood to leave, her tree of tails swishing in irritation. Her gray stripes had shaded to a deep burgundy. Her wide shoulders slumped, and she towered over the table. Bad luck, she muttered, as Lando cleared the creds off the table. Bad luck, no such thing, Lando said, laughing, even though he completely and utterly believed in luck, good, bad, and otherwise. But the Lena was agitated, and Lando did not like it when people left his sabacc table irate. Anger had a way of turning blasty, and Lando would rather smooth ruffled feathers, or fur in this case, than deal with any unpleasantness later. Belle gave Lando a look from the side of her eye that was somehow both insulting and dismissive, and turned to go. But something at the entrance of the cantina made her freeze. Oh no, bad luck. Worse luck, she muttered, the burgundy of her fur shading to a mustard yellow. She turned toward the back of the cantina, where a few folks snored, their cups of purple glandus flower juice mostly empty. Lando watched her go and then turned back to the front of the cantina to see what had caused her sudden flight. It didn't take much to guess what had provoked her distress. A shadow of figure stood in the entry, the low light barely against the gray and blue of the blaster he held. And even though Lando was quite smart, it didn't take a genius to spot a bounty hunter. The man scanned the room. He wore a helmet, and the reflective visor hid his face, making him seem even more sinister. Lando didn't bother waiting to see if the bounty hunter was looking for him. He hurriedly pocketed the few remaining creds on the table. Bad luck indeed, Lando murmured. He stood and walked nonchalantly to the bar, his eyes on the bounty hunter the entire time. Sure, the hunter could be there for anyone, but only Lando had just smuggled in 30 barrels of purple glandus flower juice, a delicious drink that was quite illegal on Hynestia. Lando was not a man to overstay his welcome, and between the skittish Lena and the bounty hunter stalking through the cantina, it was a brilliant time to plan a departure. Besides, he had more than enough creds to fuel up the Falcon and several crates of beryllium for his secreted in his ship. The last thing he needed was trouble. Lando grabbed his overcoat from a nearby hook and settled it into place nonchalantly before casually making his way to the door. He waved jauntily at the bartender as though they were old friends, and predictably, the Mon Calamari burbled dismissively. Lando schooled his expression to one of good cheer and walked toward the door. He was almost out of the cantina when his luck went completely south. Halt, Zell Grist, the bounty hunter yelled. I'm here to apprehend you, and resistance is not recommended. Lando turned to see the Lena sprint across the room toward what must have been a rear entrance, but was now a blocked door. The bounty hunter leapt across the cantina, vaulting tables and pushing patrons to the side. People shouted in dismay. A few patrons hurriedly grabbed their things and left, letting in swirls and snow in their hasty departure. Lando tried to join the fleeing fray, but someone grabbed a handful of his overcoat and yanked him backward. Not you, friend. Why don't you have a seat? A tall human woman with bright red hair and skin as pale as the Hynestia's landscape pointed a blaster at him. She was dressed all in green in the traditional garb of the Hynestians. A thick Carillion overtunic belted around the waist and shiny leggings made of cova leather, which came from the skin of an underground reptile the Hynestians hunted for food. Lando held up his hands and sank into the chair she indicated. What would this happen to be about? He asked with a cheerful grin. This would be about the purple glandus flower juice you smuggled onto Hynestia. The royal family doesn't like it when off-worlders flaunt their laws. Oh, I'm afraid you have me confused with someone else, Lando began, but drifted off when the woman shoved the blaster in his face. Sit there and be quiet, she said, and Lando pressed his lips shut. Across the cantina, the bounty hunter had caught the Lena and now held her captive. Zell's arms were locked to her body in restraining hoops, and her fur shaded to a sickly pale green. Lando felt ill just looking at her. The bounty hunter pulled out a chair and sat her next to Lando. The poor Lena let out a single yowl of despair, and Lando sighed. He knew how she felt. Everything had been going so well. Thank you so much. And again, that was from Lando's Luck, which is a Star Wars story. And the first thing I read from was from Dread Nation. if you have any questions about writing or my books or publishing in general, I'm happy to answer them. Bear with me though, I have a little bit of allergies destroying my voice. So thank you so much.
Great. We do have some questions coming in, so let me read them here too. Thank you. That was great.
Hey.
Okay, let me turn my. Great. Okay, so Aubrey is wondering, how did you get involved in writing original Star Wars stories?
It was slightly after I wrote Dread Nation. One of the questions I get a lot is, how do I write for Star Wars? And the answer is, how do you write for Star Wars? Is you write your own books first. Star Wars is, of course, is a huge property, like most of the properties you see people write for, whether it's Star Wars or Star Trek or Marvel or all those things. They really want to see that you've already been able to prove yourself kind of as a storyteller. So it was shortly before Dread Nation came out. Arcs were already going around, and one of the editors, Jen Heddle, who works at Lucasfilm Press, had approached my agent and said, would Justina like to write a Star Wars book? And I said, yeah, sure. And then like 2 weeks later, they were like, would you like to write about Lando? I'm like, well, of course. So I have my biggest recommendation is always write your own stories and pursue your own storytelling, and then look into those things afterwards.
Great, thank you. And then we've got a question here from Denise. She asks, how long have you been writing, and what influences you to write the type of books that you do?
I have been writing seriously for probably just about 12 years. I wrote, of course, in school and in college, but my undergrad was in history, so my writing was more focused on academic style writing. And the very first master's program I did was social work. But then the master's program I completed all the coursework for, except for my thesis, was in history. And then I went back later and got a master's, an MFA, master's in creative writing. So my advice is always, it's never too late to start. Because writing fiction, writing creatively is very different than the type of writing you do academically or business writing. And so it's even if you're used to writing, it's a new thing to learn. And I basically wanted to learn how to write because it was right after my daughter was born, and I was convinced I could write a better book than some of the books I was reading, which is probably the most conceited reason to ever start writing, but also the reason a lot of writers start writing. And my books tend to be how they are because I'm including all the things I like and I'm interested in. I've always been interested in history. I've always been interested in this idea of social justice and equity and who gets a voice at the table, and how we prioritize certain qualities within ourselves and each other, sometimes to the detriment of our own identities. And so my books tend to be about that, even if it's not obvious. Even if you read you pick up a Star Wars book, you're still going to get some of that conversation in there, because I do think it's important that books make you think about things. I like books the best that stick with me, that give me something to think about, something to chew on while I'm reading it. I still want to be entertained, but I like to leave the book and leave the story with something deeper to consider. And I hope that my books do that, at least for one or two people. Not everyone.
Absolutely. Great. And then kind of on that note here, we've got Kaylin's wondering, are you going to keep up with the Dread Nation series?
Deathless Divide is the last book in the Dread Nation series, which I know is not what anybody wants to hear. But I have other YA books that I'm working on right now from my same editor, because I have other original stories I want to tell. And it doesn't mean I won't come back to that series eventually. It's just for now, I left all the characters, I think, in a good place. And it's the time for people to go write fan fiction and figure out what they would like to see next. I did put on, there is a short story collection that just collects the short stories that have appeared in other places. So if you missed those, you can find that. It's called 3 for the Road. It's just digital only, and you can download it and read on your computer. But yeah, for now, Dread Nation, that series is to bed.
All right, good. And then also Aubrey's wondering, what inspired Dread Nation?
Dread Nation is inspired by a lot of things. One of the fun things about talking about a book after you've written it, I was trying to figure out what inspired it. And I know there's two real moments that inspired Dread Nation. And the first was the first time I ever went to Gettysburg. My husband's from Pennsylvania. I'm originally from California, so my husband's from Pennsylvania. And when we got out of the Army, we moved to Pennsylvania, and so we went to Gettysburg, and we were walking around the battlefield, and they were talking of, if you ever go to any of the national parks that are battlefields, there's usually docents there who will walk around and just, discuss what you're looking at. And one of the things they talk about is, how many people died there, and it's like 150,000 people. And all I could think of is like, that was a lot of people at that time in history. And, I made a joke to my husband. I was like, man, imagine all the zombies that you would, and he was just like, that's okay. And they just stuck with me. I was like, imagine all the zombies that you would get from this location. And the second thing that reason like the book came to be is I had read the graphic novel of Pride and Prejudice and Zombies. And I just remember reading it and remembering I didn't like Jane Austen that much. I didn't like Pride and Prejudice itself that much. And I was like, oh, that's right. I was just there for the zombies. But two, it was this, we talk about this thing in literature, in writing, is called the suspension of disbelief. And then that's the moment where you can get a reader to put aside their skepticism about whatever you're trying to bring them into a story and get them to go along for the ride. And I couldn't put aside my disbelief that well-to-do women would go and train in martial arts for a number of years before coming back to England. Like I couldn't get through that, because no matter how dangerous the world is, I couldn't see women saying, I'm gonna physical training in like martial arts and that kind of thing. It's difficult. Anyone who's ever tried to take up boxing, right? like you try to box for like 15 minutes, you're like, oh my God, I'm so tired. Like it's and I couldn't imagine that women who are raised in a class where they were expected to have ladies maids to take care of them and do their hair and get them dressed would be really good at defending themselves. And so I just kept following that train of thought, like, well, who would it be? Well, it would be maids. And so I just imagined, these ladies maids that would have to go and like learn how to train in combat, because, if they weren't very good, their lives would be forfeit instead of their charges. And when I pulled that thread and wondered what it would look like in the United States, I came back to the idea of that scene in Gone with the Wind, one of the very first scenes where we see Mammy and Scarlett's yelling at her to pull the corset strings tighter and pull the corset strings tighter. And she's just there as like a tool for Scarlett. Even throughout the story, she's just a tool for Scarlett to use. And that's what I kept fixating on, was like, it would have been Black women. It would have been maybe not even enslaved anymore, but we have a lot of ways of extending shadow slavery in this country, even though we don't call it slavery. And we just put another name on it. And so that's what I kept thinking of, is, instead of being domestics, women being when the books are called attendants, and having to fight, to protect the women who pay them, and putting their own lives aside. And so that's kind of where the story came from. It's just like those two things, like, why not zombies? And this real social conversation that we don't have even to this day about the expected role that we have, based on the legacy of slavery and the roles that enslaved women were expected to fulfill.
Oh, got some more popping here. So we've got from Melanie. She's wondering, how do you go about researching and preparing for writing such different genres? And what's your favorite genre to write?
Everything I write, so my favorite, that's easy. Speculative fiction is always gonna be my favorite. I like taking something like history and adding a speculative element to it. That is, for me, has always been my favorite. But I was a huge Gothic reader when I was a kid. Like, I was like, I don't know if you guys, if you don't familiar, like Phyllis Whitney used to write all these books about like this woman who went to a small town, like lived in a house, and things started happening. It's like ghosts, and usually it's not ghosts. It's like someone in the neighborhood is like trying to scare her so they can take over the house or something like that.
Yeah.
But I was always really like fascinated with like these historical settings. And that was like, so I always like to write history, but history's hard to write. Then I also like writing things that are kind of loosely based on retellings or mythology. I like the way stories are filtered and handed down, and how they change. For research, there's so much research regardless of what I'm writing. For history, right now I'm writing a book that takes place in the 1930s. And so how I usually research is from like a top-down perspective, which means I start out broad in the timeline of where I think I want my story to be, with the idea I'm playing with. And I usually read academic texts, not textbooks, but academic books, like something that comes from like a university press. And so I'll start out broad, like reading about things like, one of the things I read about for my middle grade was Pittsburgh as a city with Black culture, and as it became like we called it like the Up South or New South movement after the Great Migration. So I knew I wanted to write about the Great Migration, so I started with like Isabel Wilkerson's The Warmth of Other Suns, and that's more of like a it's historically accurate, but it's more enjoyable than academic books are. And then from there, I just would dig into different historical books, like there's a book called Up South that talks about the Great Migration, but with regards to Chicago. There's a few that talk about the Jazz Age and Black culture in like Pittsburgh and New York. Obviously, Harlem is like the big one that everyone thinks of. And then like from there, usually when you get to the historical text, they always have the stuff in your footnotes. And then I go and I dig into like the primary sources. So some people, if you're a historian, usually start with the primary sources and then you read what else is available in the area, and then you'll like move to like some, see what else is available just, generally. I like to start with that general, like tell me a story set in that time period kind of way, and then move down, because as I figure out where I want to be, things are incredibly specific. There's a difference if you're writing in Chicago or Pittsburgh. And then by the time I'm writing, I usually have a good idea of the feel of the place and like the things were happening, not like necessarily like I can tell you like what streetcar went which way, but just enough to sketch out the details for a reader.
Great. And then let me take a peek here. We've got Aubrey's wondering, what advice would you give to aspiring authors?
The advice they don't want to hear, which is to write. The only way to get better at writing is to do it. It's a lot like running. Running isn't fun, but the more you do it, the easier it gets, and the better you get at it. Writing, especially right now in the age of the internet, you're going to get a lot of conflicting advice, but what you should know is it's all good advice. It doesn't mean it's good for you advice. So I always recommend, like, if you think you want to be a writer, start Googling how do I write a book or those sorts of things. You'll usually come up with a number of either websites or old blogs. Writer's Digest has stuff. Right now I have like a 14-day like boot camp thing to prepare for NaNoWriMo, which is next month. NaNoWriMo usually has, which is National Novel Writing Month, which you don't have to do the whole novel in the month, but it's good to get started and to learn like how you write, how you produce. Are you a person who can sit down and write 10,000 words? Are you a person who's like that? I can do that one day and then never write again, or like, are you a person who can stretch it out over time? But that they have a lot of writing tips that they give you, and you should always think all writing advice is good advice, not necessarily good for you, because just because you're working on this project now, it could be that advice might not work for you, but it might be beneficial later down the road. I always talk about building a toolbox. Like if you don't want one, if you're building an actual toolbox, you're not gonna have just a pair of pliers and a screwdriver, right? You're gonna need a pair of pliers, but then there's like 6 different kinds of pliers. And then like you might want a screwdriver, but like you're gonna maybe want different sizes of screwdriver heads, right? And you got Phillips and flathead. And so these are just things you should think about with writing. You should approach writing the same way. If you want a book to start writing, I highly recommend Janet Burroway's Writing Fiction. It is probably like the entry-level book. It's not real woo-woo. It's not real philosophical. It's just like, look, this is how we make things work in a book. And here's an example of where I can show you that's how that works. So it's like when I teach an intro to fiction writing class at a university. And I always, that's the book we use, because it's just like, there's the chapters they progress very rationally. And there's not a lot of like stuff like segues into like the writer's personal philosophy on life, which you can find those books if that's something you want to read, but they might not help you become a better writer right away. And then just also be patient with yourself, because I mean, like I said, it's work and it takes time to get better at it. And everyone will tell you it's great when it's not. And so just like, just let's give yourself that room to be bad before you get better.
Awesome. And then we've got a comment. Denise says she loves hearing authors read their own books. She's with that. And then we've got a question here. Do you feel that the publishing industry is diverse enough? And if not, what strides can publishers take to reach this?
So I don't think the publishing industry is diverse enough. And every year or every other year, we have a survey that tells us the same thing. The problem is we don't have anything changing within publishing. Not all of that are things that we can do at the writer level. For a long time, there's been this push to get more writers of color into writing, more writers of color into just those spaces. But at some point, it has to change all up and down. In this last year, we've seen some of that change because I do think a lot of things that have happened this year are giving people new perspectives of the problems were always there. We just were kind of fat and happy enough that they didn't come rise to the top. And now as people start to struggle, we realize how bad things are for some groups. We need publishers to realize that there is money to be made off of a diversifying workforce, off of a broader range of options. And I think, honestly, in June, there was this big push after George Floyd was murdered to kind of like get those voices in the room to read all these books on critical race theory and the problems of the endemic nature of white supremacy and societal like limits on racism and how we see racism and how we talk about racism. But there was also a push to read more books about people who weren't white, about characters who weren't white main characters. And I think when publishers saw the groundswell of how beneficial that was financially, then we saw the change that came behind. So we have had at a lot of the big five publishers, which if you're not familiar with the big five publishers, it's Simon & Schuster, HarperCollins, Macmillan, Penguin Random House. I'm missing somebody else. I think it's Hachette is the other one. We did see a lot of those, if you keep up with like industry news, we did see a lot of those positions. They hired like diversity consultants, and they tried to make their governing board a little more diverse. They brought people up that were already within the system, within the overall publishing system, the business system that they're working in. So that's good. The problem is keeping those voices. We've seen publishers in the last 3 to 5 years make a push to hire more authors of color, more queer authors. We have a huge like bottom layer of younger white women that work in publishing, but then we get the upper layers very, very male dominated. So there was a lot of movement there as well. The problem is retention. And that's always the problem with any diversity action, is that once you get people in the room, how do you keep them in the room? And the answer is you empower them, which means you have to change the system that you're working in. So do I think publishing is diverse enough? No. Do I think there are people working very hard to change that? Yes. Do I think it'll change the next 2 years? Probably not. I mean, especially as we head into an economic downturn, people tend to be a little less daring in the things that they do when the bottom line is a little tighter. But I'm hoping in the next 10 years, this is a question where we're kind of like, yeah, look at all these amazing editors and publishers we see of color.
Thank you. And then got another one coming in. So this question is, how has the pandemic influenced your writing habits? You made any changes?
No, not at all. I mean, like, we're doing this virtually instead of me traveling. I've said yes to a lot more stuff. I usually say no to a lot of stuff because of the travel. When I'm traveling, I'm not writing, and I make my money writing. I pay my bills writing. I'm a full-time author. I don't have a day job any longer. And I've only been a full-time author for about the last 2 years. My first book came out in 2013. So, I mean, you can do that math. It took a really long time to get to the point where I could support my family and myself off of my writing. But for the pandemic, I work at home. I still work at home. I have an office. I rent an office space in a building. I still go there once in a while. It's a building that's pretty empty because it's mostly like lawyers in the building. So they've all not been in the building. So, I mean, it's nothing's really changed for me, except now I wear a mask when I go to the grocery store. For my husband, he works from home now. So, but he also has a job where he's on his computer all day. So it's not that different. My daughter is 12, so she's just about old enough to do most of the things on her own. So it's not like I have to sit with her when she's doing class, and it's just mostly yelling at her to do her homework, which is no different than regular life.
Oh yeah. And then got another one here. Let's see. What are your next what are your next projects? What do you have coming up that we can watch for?
So I have my next project is a Star Wars book. It's called The Test of Courage. That's what it looks like.
Mm-hmm.
And this is completely original, set in the Star Wars galaxy. So these aren't characters that you've seen on a movie and a TV show, and we're writing the fiction, to kind of bring them to the publishing side. We're doing the opposite, which is we're creating books and stories of these characters, and then hopefully they'll make a movie or a TV show after it, because that's what people really want, so it's the TV. And so that's next. That comes out in January 5th. And then after that is I have a middle grade, and that's my first original middle grade, because I've written a few Star Wars middle grades. And that's called Ophi's Ghost. And it's about a little girl who's her and her mother flee Georgia for Pittsburgh, and she gets a job as a lady's maid or a helper in a mansion that's very haunted. And she discovers after they leave Georgia that she can see ghosts. And so it's kind of that conversation of like, how do you deal with your life is already difficult, and then there's one more thing added to it. And then I'll have another Star Wars YA coming out next fall 2021. And then my Next Me book, Next Me YA, will come out in summer of 22. And that's a book right now called Rusted Magic, and it takes place. It's like a magical version of the Civilian Conservation Corps, if people are familiar with that. So it takes place in the 1930s during the Depression, Dust Bowl, but magic. So different problems, same problems, but more problems.
Oh, those sound great. I'm excited. And then another question here. Any hopes of a Dread Nation movie?
There's always hope of somebody paying me lots of money to make movies. I will say that we had sold rights before for a TV show, and then the rights were never exploited, and I'm about to sell rights again. So whether things will ever come to go to production, I can't say. I will say that if there is a movie, I will not be involved, because I like writing books, and somebody else can do all that work of making a movie and everything else. So,
well, great. Thank you so much. I think that was all of our questions. But yeah, well, great. Thank you. This was fantastic. Thanks so much for joining us virtually. We were so excited to have you. And so we've got on our Book Festival website a link to bookshop.org. We can get all of Justina's books. And then we have links to your social media and your website. So you can keep track of what she's up to there. But thank you.
And I'll be back on Saturday for a panel.
Yeah, she'll be back. She's kind enough to do a panel with us. So please stay tuned. Join us on Saturday, and we'll hope to see everyone at other events throughout the week. But we'll see you then. Thank you so much. Bye, everybody. Thank you.